So this brings us then to our last section where we're going to talk about populations that are squarely within our own species designation. So we'll start with the archaic Homo sapiens. Now we've got some skulls specifically throughout the Middle East and southern Asia that aren't clearly one particular subspecies, that aren't necessarily Neanderthals, that aren't necessarily Denisovans, that aren't necessarily anatomically modern Homo sapiens, but instead are some kind of weird mix of the three. We've got the Neanderthals that are perhaps best represented by the populations from Western Europe, though Neanderthals were also found in the Middle East and Western Asia. Um, Critically, they were named from the Neander Valley. Neanderthal literally translates into Neander Valley. They were thought to be cold adapted with a suite of traits that included things like short, stocky build, barrel chest, um, large nasal passages that are able to heat the air before it reaches their lungs, so on and so forth. But they've also been found with, let's say, not quite as robust features in the more temperate areas of the Middle East and Western Asia. So that cold adaptation may not characterize the whole subspecies, but may in fact be very specific to the population found in Western Europe. Neanderthals use a tool tradition that's called Mousterian, which is even more finely retouched than the Acheulean tools of Homo erectus. They hunted large megafauna, so we're talking about mastodons, mammoths, cave bears, ground sloths, etc. They wore clothes, they made tools, complex tools, they hunted, cooperatively hunted. They cared for the disabled. We've got a large proportion of Neanderthal skeletons that we have that show some evidence of trauma, and not trauma that killed them, but rather trauma that was healed and repeated trauma. So, I mean, they cared for their disabled to the point that the disabled were able to heal and then rejoin life. We also have some young Neanderthal skeletons that show, let's say, genetic abnormality or what we would call developmental disability in like skeletal structure and stuff. So there are young Neanderthals that weren't ever able to walk, for example, but were kept alive until about the age of 5 to 8. So clearly something going on culturally that allowed that had them care for those that had troubles, those that had adversity, and to keep them alive. So they were producing enough calories that people who weren't able to help hunt were still able to eat. There's also evidence that they buried their dead, and in one particular cave area, evidence that there were a lot of fossilized pollen granules that are present on the Neanderthal specimens that were buried there. So this idea of throwing flowers into the grave represents presumably some sort of religious ritual. And so many of their cultural features are fairly similar to what we see in fully modern populations as well. They likely had some rudimentary form of language. They would have had to be able to coordinate some of the cultural kinds of aspects of their life that they coordinated. But there is still evidence of Neanderthals demonstrating what we call a rough life, or what I would liken to the soundtrack of Annie with "It's a Hard Knock Life" for us. Most Neanderthals that we are able to study have this evidence of trauma. There's also a really big difference in the kind of cave paintings that Neanderthals produce and those that modern Homo sapiens produce. And so specifically, there's a relatively recent headline that relates the complexity of cave paintings to aspects of their hunting. So Neanderthals hunted by getting it really close to the animals. So they would fashion points to spears, but they wouldn't throw those spears. Instead, they would carry those spears close enough to large megafauna that they could then stab them, thrust those spears toward the animals. Well, imagine doing that to a mastodon or a mammoth, right? Particularly a male that has tusks. It raises the likelihood that you're going to get injured. I mean, just heck, even modern elephant hunting, right? Are you going to go hunt an elephant by thrusting a handheld spear into its hide? Probably not. You're going to get kicked. You're going to get stepped on. You're going to get gored by the tusks. So, this kind of close range hunting that Neanderthals practiced left marks on their skeletons and resulted in a high level of what we would call morbidity or injury. Denisovans are a sister group to the Neanderthals. So we're talking about the same time period. Basically, presumably Heidelbergensis or some other uh, archaic Homo sapien moved into the Middle East, and from the Middle East, Neanderthals branched westward, while Denisovans branched eastward. They lived in Asia. They're named from Denisova, which is a cave in southern Siberia. They have some interesting DNA markers that are only present in one population, really, one group of modern humans, and that is modern Melanesians, those that live in the in Papua New Guinea and some of those other Melanesian islands. In fact, there was a headline about 5 or 10 years ago that stated that Melanesians have quote unquote alien DNA. That alien DNA was not, in fact, extraterrestrial DNA, but rather was simply Denisovan DNA. We know a lot about Denisovans genetically because we've sequenced the entire genome. We don't know a lot about Denisovans culturally. We don't even have like a complete skeleton that's put together or any kind of artist interpretation of what they would have looked like. Relatively recently, we have found one female child that is a hybrid between Neanderthals and Denisovans. So typically, historically, we've thought of these as two distinct populations, but there's now evidence that there was hybridization between the two, and of course, genetic evidence that we had hybridization of each with modern Homo sapiens as well. So our evolutionary history, particularly from archaic Homo sapiens on, is like a genetic hodgepodge. We were subspecies that were expansionist. We were subspecies that were quite willing to spread our genetic material far and wide whenever we had the opportunity. So what happened then after archaic Homo sapiens? Well, there used to be two schools of thought. Back when I started graduate school in '97, we were at the end of the era of what was thought of as multi-regionalism. So a multi-regional model of human evolution stated that Homo erectus left Africa, that individually in different areas, Homo erectus gave rise to archaic Homo sapiens, and that individually in different areas of the world, archaic Homo sapiens gave rise to modern humans. Well, there's not evidence to support this, right? We now have an abundance of molecular evidence that points to our origins in Africa. We've got what are called, we've got the mitochondrial Eve. That is, when we look at mitochondrial DNA, you only get your mitochondria from your mom because all that's in the head of a sperm is nuclear DNA. And we can all trace our mitochondrial lineage back to a group of closely related human females that lived in sub-Saharan Africa sometime between 300 and 200,000 years ago. We also have been able to track the derivatives of the Y chromosome, and we can trace all males on the planet can trace their ancestry back to a small population of closely related males that lived in sub-Saharan Africa sometime between 300 and 200,000 years ago. So we talk about the mitochondrial Eve and the Y chromosome Adam. Yes, that's co-opting standard Christian creation mythology, but in doing so, that creates what we call sexy headlines, or headlines that people want to read. Well, now it's looking a bit more complicated. That idea of a single group of early, anatomically modern Homo sapiens arising in sub-Saharan Africa around 300,000 years ago, that represents what we call a single point of origin. And that implies that we can trace our origin back to a single place in Africa, because as a continent, Africa's really, really big. And so now we're getting a picture that's much more complex. We evolved from ancestral hominins in Africa, but we did it in a complicated fashion, and a fashion that involves the entire African continent. We now have a Moroccan cave called Jebel Irhoud that has 315,000-year-old bones that are anatomically modern Homo sapiens. So, before we thought, well, we evolved around 200,000 years ago, lived in Africa for about 150,000 years, then left Africa around 50,000 years ago. Well, no, we were in Morocco, which is not sub-Saharan Africa, right? This is northern Africa, crossing the Sahara Desert by 315,000 years ago. So either we evolved in Morocco prior to this point, right? Or we evolved in sub-Saharan Africa much earlier than 315,000 years ago, pushing that date of the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens potentially to 400,000 years ago. So it pushes back the proposed dawn of our species. It also adds Northwest Africa to a list of possible origin sites. These Homo sapiens in Africa or in Morocco have an odd combination of features. They have the flat faces of modern humans with an elongated skull, particularly at the back, of Homo erectus. So from the front, they would pass for a fully modern human. You dress them in a business suit, wouldn't notice the difference. But if you looked at them from profile, from the side, they would have had extremely elongated skulls. So they would stand out. They would look weird. We also then have a unique mixture of modern and ancient traits and a variety of combinations all over Africa. We have the Florisbad skull that dates to 260,000 years ago in South Africa. We have a skull from Omo Kabish in Ethiopia that's 195,000 years ago. We have a Herto skull from Ethiopia that dates to 160,000 years ago. Some scientists have argued that these three specific skulls represent different subspecies of Homo sapiens that are not fully modern. Some recommend that they're different species altogether, but the differences aren't really enough to classify them as different species. They all could potentially be fully anatomically modern Homo sapiens with a lot more diversity in our phenotypes and our skull morphology than we currently see. And so Eleanor Seri, an archaeologist from the University of Oxford, says if you look at these skulls, you'll see different features of modern humans arising in different locations at different times. For that reason, she states that we are a species with multiple African origins, and therefore we see African multi-regionalism. So it's kind of a hybrid of multi-regional and single point of origin, right? We all come from Africa, yes, that is undisputable, but, or at least as of now, undisputable. But it's not a simple story of one site in Africa from which we all came, and then as we left Africa, we displaced other hominins that were already in place. So we didn't like form in one spot and then come out of Africa and kill off everybody or competitively exclude them. Rather, we had a whole lot of gene flow, right? That hominins were evolving different features in different parts of Africa: elongated skulls versus rounded skulls, flat faces versus prognathous faces, so on and so forth. And everywhere we went, we exchanged genetic material. And then it's really not until we leave Africa that we settle on a standard, let's say, morphology, a standard phenotype, a standard Homo sapiens face. So this may say more about who left Africa than anything else. Maybe the fact that we all look very similar in facial structure today has more to do with a founding effect than it does with some, let's say, evolutionary adaptive advantage. One of the features that we evolved pretty late are chins. We don't have chins until we're anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and there's a prevailing belief that that chins are not adaptive in the sense of aiding survival, but instead are a sexually selected trait. That basically women thought chins looked sexy and chose to preferentially mate with men who had chins, even though chins didn't really make them survive any better. We also, at the same point in time, have some standout populations. We've got the hobbits, Homo floresiensis. They were tiny humans that inhabited the Indonesian island of Flores until fairly recent times. The remains date between 95 and 50,000 years before present. They had a very small skull. They were only about 3 feet tall, had a skull of about 370 cubic centimeters. They were originally described as basically a midget Homo erectus, right? And a downsized version, a little diminutive, dwarfed version of Homo erectus. They face unusual evolutionary forces. When we look at what happens to mammals um, versus reptiles on islands, we find that mammals are often dwarfed. So, for example, on the island of Flores, they also had dwarf elephants, whereas reptiles get really large. And so on the island of Flores, they have Komodo dragons. So perhaps these hominins maintained this diminutive stature so that they could hide from these incredibly gigantic lizards. They controlled fire. They made stone tools that qualify as blade level stone tools that they would have mounted on wooden shafts to spear hunt. They were presumably wiped out in a volcanic eruption around 12,000 years ago, though the Nagda people of Flores and the Mangari people of Flores tell stories about the little people that lived in the mountainous areas and caves until the Dutch arrived in the 16th century. So they could have persisted into even fairly recent times. We also have Homo naledi, who was found in 2016 or 2013, named in 2015, published heavily in 2016. Homo naledi was originally thought to potentially be um, perhaps the very first representative of the genus Homo, awaiting dates. Had a very tiny brain, about 560 cubic centimeters, had ape-like shoulders for climbing, had primitive premolar roots, had hands that were indistinguishable from modern human hands, had molar crowns that were small with five cusps like modern humans. So a really interesting mix um, of primitive and modern characteristics. The dates have now come back for Homo naledi, and it dates to about 200, 300,000 years ago. So, not an ancestral species to modern Homo sapiens, but instead a sister species that persisted until relatively recently. There's another group that's found in China called the Red Deer Cave people who lived in this cave and hunted red deer, who again are an evolutionary offshoot that persisted until about 200,000 years ago. So even into relatively modern times, we have multiple isolated populations that persisted. One of the things that we're interested in answering as we move into this realm of fully anatomically modern Homo sapiens is, not really when do we get modern features in terms of morphology, but more so when do we become modern in behavior. Scientists agree that around 6 million years ago, we've got the first hominins that became habitual bipeds. By 3.3 million years ago, we were making crude stone tools. By 1.7 million years ago, hominins spread to Asia and eventually Europe, including Homo erectus. And by 200,000 years ago, we've got unequivocal anatomically modern Homo sapiens that eventually first stay in Africa and then eventually leave Africa. We don't agree though on when modern humans reach behavioral modernity, which is defined as fully human behavior based on symbolic thought and cultural creativity. In other words, when do we start to rely on culture more than we rely on biology? When do we become incredibly innovative? When do we become the creators? When do we get what Augustine Fuentes calls that creative spark? We first thought that behavioral modernity didn't emerge until about 45, 50,000 years ago when anatomically modern humans went into Europe and started inhabiting caves and then painting caves. And so looking at markers like art as that first defining feature of modern humanity. Well, we've got to recognize that before that point, we have creativity and tools. We've got three divisions of the Paleolithic. Paleolithic translates into Old Stone Age. We've got the Lower Paleolithic, or the oldest Old Stone Age, with the Acheulean tools of Homo erectus, pictured here on the top. We've got the Middle Paleolithic, with archaic Homo sapiens, including Neanderthals, and Mousterian tools, pictured in the middle. And then we've got the Upper Paleolithic, with anatomically modern Homo sapiens and their blade technology, pictured here at the bottom. Blade tools are functionally different, okay? When you're hitting a prepared core, you end up with flakes that break off. Flakes are not necessarily uniform in their manufacture. When you are striking blades off a prepared core, they are fairly uniform. So we've got kind of the standardization of tool manufacture. Blades are also at least twice as long as they are wide, which makes them perfect projectile points. They become very effective spearheads. We also develop additional technology that doesn't preserve as well at older sites, like the atlatl, which is a device that allows us to throw our spear with more force from farther away. So we talked about that difference in artwork between Neanderthals and modern humans, that may have represented different hunting styles. So that difference in artwork represents difference in cognition, a difference in the physics involved in hunting. Once we start throwing spears, we have to be able to figure out trajectories. We have to figure out arc. We have to figure out, mass and force and acceleration. We have to do a lot more complex mental calculations. So there's an increase in how we use our brains, even though there's not an increase in the size of our brains. And so when we start throwing spears and then using an atlatl to throw spears from even farther, and then we start fastening smaller bladelets to things like arrows, and develop a bow, we're reducing the likelihood we're going to get hurt, right? We reduce our morbidity and our mortality. With hunting, we can suddenly be farther away. We suddenly don't have to be big and burly and able to wrestle cave bears to the ground, right? We can be pretty far away and use technology to increase our hunting yield. So we start to rely more on culture than we do on our physicality to hunt things, and that's represented in our IQ and our cognitive capacity and in all aspects of culture. So in the Upper Paleolithic, we've got advances in tool making that emphasize blade tools, where they're hammered off a prepared core. These blades may be modified to produce a variety of special purpose tools. We start to see things like awls and burins and fish hooks and harpoons and such. We're fashioning these onto a variety of shafts. We're starting to work with wood. We see the emergence of pins and needles for sewing. We see knives. We see really toolkits that become increasingly specialized for the particular ecology that humans find themselves in. So if you found yourself on the shore, you would have fish hooks and perhaps harpoons. If you found yourself in the woods, you might have scrapers and burins to work with the wood that's available. What this does is allows us to really kind of move into a variety of habitats, allows us to effectively exploit those habitats. This is coupled with ecological changes that are going to set the stage for rapid human cultural adaptation. We've got the end of the last ice age between about 17,000 and 12,000 years ago. These large megafauna, the herbivores, gradually move north. Some people follow their prey. As they follow their prey, they move into places like the New World. They move into Australia. They move into areas that have completely different suites of animals and completely different kinds of animals available for hunting, completely different resources to work with. We see Western Europeans being forced to use a greater variety of foods. If you stayed in Western Europe, then you're losing the megafauna. You can't rely on things like mammoths and mastodons. Instead, you're going to have to start hunting things like gazelles and rabbits and deer and stuff. Hunting small solitary creatures requires a completely different cognition than hunting large megafauna. You're going to lose nomadism, for example. This is going to set the stage for the eventual domestication of plants and animals. We're going to have a question that says, which came first, sedentism or domestication? The answer is sedentism. We see the proliferation of large stands of cereal grains like barley, oats, rice, wheat, etc. This is also going to be a precursor then to domestication. We see the continental shelf become an area that can be viably exploited. This allows us to go after shellfish. Marshes are areas where shorebirds nest, so we can start to add duck and geese eggs to our diet. We can start to hunt waterfowl with bow and arrow technology. So in southwestern Europe, in the Middle East, the economies become less specialized. We are no longer big game hunters. We are instead sedentary foragers who are increasing the amount of our diet that's based on plant resources, who start to hunt in different ways. Kent Flannery calls this the beginning of the broad spectrum revolution. We're going to talk about the broad spectrum revolution and the origins of the Mesolithic even more next week as we talk about the advent of agriculture. But this is where we see sedentism emerge. This is where we start to see a diet that's based on grinding grain. Those grains are initially wild and then eventually are domesticated. We're going to see a diet that has hunted resources of things that are small and solitary. So we start to move away from large group hunting and instead start to hunt solitarily. So, we build houses to store resources. We develop these cultural features, specializations, weaving, artwork, all of this stuff that proliferates during the Mesolithic and then the Neolithic. We see the emergence of cave art. This follows people's movements. Some of the oldest known cave paintings date back 36,000 years. Most are in southwestern France and northern Spain, though this may be a measure of how well those paintings were preserved, more so than how much they were produced. But these cave paintings represent modern artwork. These cave paintings may have magical or ritual functions, or they could just be art, right? They may not have had such ritual significance. They often, though, occur in clusters. They're a form of pictorial history. They coincide with the glacial retreat. So here we've got some images of cave paintings. They may have been these cave paintings may have been entreaties to the spirits to increase their hunting returns. They may have been stories of what happened while they were hunting. They may have been kind of a marker of cultural change, or they may have been none of the above. During the same period of time, we've got movement of people into other areas of the world. So we have anatomically modern Homo sapiens reaching Australia by 50,000 years ago, reaching the Americas around 20,000 years ago, not reaching the Pacific Islands, though, until about 3,000 years ago. And that's because those islands are few and far between, and you've got vast ocean distances that have to be crossed. And so you've got to have vessels and technological innovation that are able to make those distances. Plus, you've got to have knowledge of navigation through star charts and such. So as we talk about the peopling of the New World, which of course is of particular interest to anyone studying Native American culture, it initially involved following big game herds across Beringia. Then there were unglaciated corridors in the New Worlds. Now, interestingly, in the New World, we've got different animal species available, and critically, animals don't have 2 million years of hunting pressures that shaped their behaviors. So when modern humans made it to the New World, they basically found really large animals that weren't afraid of them. And so we end up driving a lot of those populations to extinction. We don't have then the same suite of animals present for domestication. So this is going to influence the species available to domesticate as we kind of move into agriculture next week. And so, in summary, with this whole long, vast lecture, know these four key human attributes. That's bipedality, that's large brain size coupled with childhood dependence, that's changes in tool use, and that's changes in teeth. Be able to discuss their significance for hominin evolution, understand our chronology of human evolution, hominin evolution, even though it's not always linear, be able to identify the oldest known bipeds, approximately when they appeared, how we know that they were bipedal, and how they're connected to Australopiths and Homo. Be able to identify and distinguish the Australopiths, that key hominin group between 5 and 2 million years, know the difference between gracile and robust Australopiths, how they may relate to early Homo, understand the earliest stone tools, be able to put them in sequence and associate them with their hominin, that is Lomekwian with perhaps pre-Australopiths or early Australopiths, Oldowan with gracile Australopiths and early Homo, Acheulean with Homo erectus, Mousterian with archaic Homo sapiens, and Blades with modern Homo sapiens. understand the adaptive strategy, hunting and gathering of Homo erectus, and how it enabled us to move out of Africa, know who the archaic Homo sapiens are, know who the Neanderthals and Denisovans are, how they all interrelate, how tools changed over the Paleolithic, the role that Ice Age has played in the evolution of modern humans, and then the movements of modern humans into other areas of the world.